By the spring of 1945, George Smith Patton had won the kind of victory that should have ended a career in applause. His Third Army had ripped across France, shattered German defenses in the Ardennes, and driven deep into the heart of the Reich with a speed that stunned allies and enemies alike. Newspapers celebrated the dash of his tanks. Soldiers repeated stories of his relentless energy, and commanders privately admitted that few men alive could have done what Patton had done with such violence and momentum. Yet as Germany collapsed, the cheers around him grew thinner, replaced by closed doors, careful words, and a growing sense that the war hero no longer fit the world being built after it. Patton felt it immediately. In May, as Allied flags rose over ruined cities, he walked through the wreckage with a soldier's eye, already thinking about what came next. To him, the enemy had changed uniforms, but not nature. He believed that the Soviet Union, not defeated Germany, was the true threat to Europe's future. While other generals spoke cautiously about reconstruction and cooperation, Patton spoke bluntly, sometimes recklessly, about missed opportunities. He told officers that the Western Allies should have driven east faster, that they should have reached Prague and Vienna before the Red Army, that history would regret letting Stalin claim so much of the continent. These were not private thoughts murmured in a tent. Patton said them aloud, often, and he said them to anyone who would listen. This was dangerous ground in 1945. The alliance with the Soviet Union was fragile but necessary, and the political leadership in Washington and London was determined to preserve it, at least publicly. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander and Patton's superior, understood this balance better than anyone. Eisenhower admired Patton's battlefield genius, but he had long worried about his inability to restrain himself once the guns fell silent. Patton did not soften his words for diplomats or politicians. He had never learned to perform that kind of restraint, and he had little interest in starting now. The tension grew sharper as Patton took command of military government in Bavaria. His task was to oversee occupation, restore order, and begin the slow process of denazification. From the beginning, Patton treated the assignment with visible irritation. He saw it as a distraction from real soldiering, and he resented what he considered hypocrisy in the process. Germany, he argued, could not function if every former party member was removed from administration. In private and sometimes in public, he compared the Nazi Party to political parties elsewhere, including in the United States. To many ears, this sounded less like pragmatism and more like moral blindness. Then came the comments that ignited a storm. In conversations with reporters, Patton suggested that Nazis were being unfairly singled out, that many had simply joined the party to survive. In one widely reported exchange, he compared the Nazi Party to the Democrats and Republicans back home. The reaction was swift and brutal. Headlines exploded across America. Jewish organizations protested. Political leaders demanded explanations. To a public still absorbing the horror of concentration camps, Patton's words sounded like betrayal. Eisenhower acted decisively. He relieved Patton of his position as military governor, reassigned him to command the 15th Army, a paper organization tasked with writing histories of the war. It was a humiliating demotion, one that Patton felt deeply. He told friends that he had been sidelined, that his career was being quietly ended not because he had failed, but because he had spoken truths others were afraid to say. Whether those truths were wise or reckless no longer mattered. The damage was done. Behind the scenes, Patton's relationships were fraying. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, his old rival, had never forgiven Patton's criticisms and showmanship. Other Allied commanders considered him unpredictable, even dangerous in the political climate of peace. To Soviet officials, Patton was openly hostile. His remarks about fighting the Red Army, if given the chance, were noted, remembered, and passed along. In Moscow, he was not seen as a colorful American general, but as a potential enemy who did not know when to stop talking. Patton sensed his isolation. In letters to his wife Beatrice, he oscillated between pride and bitterness. He wrote of his achievements with the certainty of a man who knew history would vindicate him, and of his present situation with the anger of someone who felt cast aside. He wanted another command, another war, something that would restore meaning to his life. Peace bored him. Politics disgusted him. He was a warrior without a battlefield, and that made him restless in ways those around him found unsettling. Even his health reflected the strain. He complained of headaches, insomnia, and a constant feeling of pressure. Friends noticed that his temper, always fierce, flared faster now. He hunted to calm himself, riding across the Bavarian countryside with a rifle in hand, trying to recapture the clarity he had known at the front. In those moments, he felt alive again. But they did not last. When the hunts ended, the uncertainty returned. There were whispers, too, though quiet and easily dismissed at the time. Patton knew too much, some said. He had seen the shape of the post-war world and disliked it. He spoke too freely about the Soviets, about future conflict, about decisions made behind closed doors. In a world shifting rapidly from total war to uneasy peace, such a man was inconvenient. Officially, there was no conspiracy, no plot, only a general whose mouth had outrun his usefulness. Unofficially, doubts began to form, small and formless, but persistent. By November 1945, Patton's future was unclear. He remained a four-star general, but without real power. He talked about returning to the United States, about writing, about perhaps taking another command if one became available. He also spoke of his frustration, sometimes with a bitterness that alarmed those close to him. He had survived bullets, shells, and the chaos of battle, only to find himself defeated by peace. When he climbed into his staff car on December 9th, 1945, heading out for another hunt, he carried all of this with him. The victories, the controversies, the grudges, the words that could not be taken back. To the world, he was still General Patton, the man who had helped crush Nazi Germany. To those in power, he was a problem that history might solve on its own. The road ahead seemed ordinary, unremarkable, and safe. No one imagined that within hours, the story of George Patton would take a turn so abrupt and so final that it would leave questions echoing for generations, unanswered and impossible to ignore. The morning of December 9th, 1945, broke cold and clear over southern Germany. A thin winter sun hung low above the countryside near Mannheim, illuminating bare trees, frost-hardened fields, and roads that had survived years of war with surprising calm. The fighting was over here. Tanks no longer roared past farmhouses, and artillery no longer shook the ground. It was the kind of quiet that came only after devastation had exhausted itself. George Patton rose early, impatient as always. He planned to go pheasant hunting, a simple excursion meant to clear his head. The war was finished, his command reduced to paperwork and historical reports, and the hunt offered a familiar rhythm. He dressed carefully, spoke briefly with his staff, and climbed into the back seat of his staff car, a 1938 Cadillac Series 75. At the wheel was Private First Class Horace Woodring, an experienced driver. In the front passenger seat sat Major General Hobart Gay, Patton's longtime chief of staff and trusted companion. Patton was in good spirits. Witnesses later recalled that he talked easily during the drive, pointing out features of the countryside and discussing the hunt ahead. He had always believed fate favored the bold, and he felt, at least that morning, untouched by danger. After all he had survived, a short drive on a quiet road hardly seemed worth concern. The Cadillac rolled along a secondary road near the village of Käfertal, moving at a moderate speed. Ahead, an American Army truck approached an intersection, driven by Private Robert Thompson. The truck slowed, preparing to turn. The road was straight, visibility clear. There were no explosions, no chaos, no enemy fire. Just two American vehicles, operated by trained soldiers, meeting in peacetime Germany. What happened next lasted only seconds. As the truck turned left across the Cadillac's path, Woodring braked hard and swerved, but there was no time. The Cadillac struck the truck at an angle, not violently, not with the kind of force that usually kills generals who have survived years of war. The impact crushed the front of the Cadillac, twisting metal and shattering glass. Gay and Woodring were thrown forward, injured but conscious. Patton, seated in the back, was thrown violently ahead. When the car came to rest, there was an eerie stillness. Gay turned, dazed, and saw Patton slumped forward, motionless. His face was pale, his eyes open but unfocused. Gay called his name. There was no response. For a moment he feared Patton was dead. Then he noticed shallow breathing. The injuries were immediately strange. Gay and Woodring had suffered cuts and bruises, broken bones that would heal. Patton, however, complained that he could not move. His head had snapped forward at the moment of impact, his chin striking the metal partition behind the front seat. The blow had hyperextended his neck, fracturing vertebrae and damaging his spinal cord. His body, so often in motion, was suddenly silent from the neck down. Medics arrived quickly. Patton remained conscious as he was lifted from the wreckage and placed on a stretcher. He spoke calmly, even dryly, according to witnesses. He remarked that he had survived so much, only to be injured in what seemed a ridiculous accident. There was no panic in his voice, only disbelief. He was taken first to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, one of the best-equipped American medical facilities in Europe. Doctors examined him carefully and delivered the diagnosis with grave precision. He was paralyzed from the neck down. His breathing was shallow but steady. His mind was clear. For a man like Patton, the verdict was devastating. News of the accident spread rapidly through Allied headquarters. Reactions ranged from shock to uneasy resignation. Some officers shook their heads at the irony. Others, more cautious, noted how unusual it seemed that such a minor collision had produced such catastrophic injury. Automobiles crashed violently across Europe every day during the war, often without fatal consequences. This one stood out. Doctors immobilized Patton's neck and began round-the-clock care. They believed he might survive, though his chances of regaining movement were almost non-existent. Patton listened as they explained his condition. He asked precise questions, the kind a commander might ask about a battlefield situation. When told he would likely never walk again, he absorbed it quietly. Later, alone with Gay, he spoke more freely. He said he would rather have died in battle than live helpless in a bed. Outside the hospital room, life moved on. Reports were written, statements prepared. The accident was officially logged as a routine traffic collision, an unfortunate but simple explanation. The driver of the truck was cleared of wrongdoing. The driver of the Cadillac was found to have done everything possible to avoid the crash. No further investigation was ordered. Yet even in those first hours, doubts crept in. Officers who knew Patton well whispered about the improbability. The road had been clear, the speed had been low, the injuries were wildly unequal. How could the most physically powerful man in the car be the only one so gravely wounded? There were no immediate answers, only questions that felt uncomfortable to ask. Patton himself sensed the strangeness. From his hospital bed, he spoke of the accident with a mixture of bitterness and dark humor. He told visitors that fate had finally caught him, not with enemy fire but with bureaucracy and bad luck. Still, his eyes betrayed something deeper, a frustration that went beyond pain. He had been reduced to stillness at the very moment his voice was most unwelcome. As night fell over Heidelberg, the hospital corridors quieted. Patton lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of distant footsteps and murmured conversations. He could feel nothing below his shoulders. The war that had defined him was over, and now his body seemed to have ended the fight as well. The road outside Mannheim faded quickly from public memory. It was marked no differently than any other stretch of pavement in occupied Germany. No monument rose there, no warning sign hinted at its role in history. Yet on that unremarkable strip of asphalt, the life of one of America's most famous generals had been irrevocably altered. What no one could yet know was that the crash would not be the end of the mystery. Patton was alive, conscious, and under constant care. His death, when it came, would not arrive immediately or cleanly. Instead, it would unfold slowly, behind hospital walls, amid visitors, official reports, and decisions that would leave behind a trail of silence far harder to explain than the collision itself. George Patton entered the Heidelberg Hospital as a legend and woke each morning as a prisoner of his own body. The room was bright, orderly, and efficient, filled with the faint smells of antiseptic and winter air. Outside the windows, Germany was settling into occupation and rebuilding. But inside the room, time slowed to a crawl. For a man who had lived by motion, command, and noise, the silence was its own kind of torment. Doctors quickly realized that Patton's condition was stable but severe. The fracture to his cervical vertebrae had damaged the spinal cord high in the neck, leaving him paralyzed from the chest down. He could move his head slightly and speak clearly, but his arms and legs were lifeless. His breathing depended on careful positioning and constant monitoring. Any sudden movement, any mistake, could end his life. Patton understood this better than anyone. He had studied wounds all his life, watched men fade from injuries that seemed survivable and others endure horrors that should have killed them. He listened closely to the doctors, absorbing their cautious optimism and unspoken doubts. When they left the room, he often stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched, as if memorizing every crack in the plaster. The stillness was not peaceful. It was unbearable. Visitors came steadily at first. General Eisenhower sent messages of concern, carefully worded and respectful. Senior officers stopped by, standing awkwardly at the bedside, unsure how to speak to a man who had once dominated every room he entered. Patton greeted them politely, sometimes even warmly, but the conversations were short. He hated being seen like this. He hated the pity in their eyes even more than the pain. His wife Beatrice arrived from the United States as quickly as she could. Her presence changed the atmosphere of the room. With her, Patton allowed himself moments of vulnerability he showed no one else. He spoke openly about his fear of living paralyzed, about his sense that his life's purpose had already ended. He told her he would rather have died outright than linger like this. She listened, steady and composed, even as the weight of his words pressed heavily between them. Despite his condition, Patton remained mentally sharp. He followed world events closely, reading newspapers and discussing politics with visitors. The growing tension between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union did not surprise him. He commented bitterly that the war had ended too early and too late at the same time. Too early to stop what he believed was the true threat, and too late for him to have any say in what came next. As the days passed, the tone of official attention subtly shifted. Visits from senior commanders became less frequent. Conversations grew more restrained. Patton noticed it. He had spent his life reading men, and even from a hospital bed, he could sense when interest cooled. He was no longer an asset, no longer a problem, just a wounded general awaiting an uncertain outcome. Medical care remained constant, but cautious. Nurses turned him regularly to prevent bed sores, adjusted his position to help him breathe, and monitored his temperature and pulse with meticulous care. The doctors warned repeatedly about the danger of pneumonia, a common and often fatal complication for patients with spinal injuries. Patton listened, grimly aware that his body now depended entirely on others. At times, his mood darkened. He spoke of death not as a fear, but as a release. He told visitors that fate had played a cruel joke, sparing him through battles only to trap him in helplessness. Yet he did not beg for an end. He endured, perhaps out of discipline, perhaps out of habit. The same stubborn will that had driven armies forward now held him in place. Rumors began circulating quietly among officers and staff. Nothing dramatic, nothing openly spoken, just questions that hung in the air. Why had such a minor crash produced such catastrophic injuries? Why had Patton been the only one so gravely hurt? Why had there been no deeper investigation beyond the initial report? These questions were rarely voiced aloud, and when they were quickly dismissed. Accidents happened. War had been full of them. Peace was no different. Patton himself did not openly suggest foul play. He was careful with his words, especially in the presence of doctors and officials. Still, he made remarks that hinted at unease. He told one visitor that he felt as though history had decided to silence him. To another, he joked darkly that he had finally been stopped without a fight. Whether these were expressions of bitterness or something more was impossible to say. Then his condition worsened. In mid-December, Patton developed difficulty breathing. Doctors diagnosed pneumonia, exactly as they had feared. Despite aggressive treatment, including antibiotics that were still relatively new, his strength faded. His voice grew weaker, his breaths more labored. Beatrice remained at his side, holding his hand, speaking softly even when he could no longer respond clearly. On December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton died. The official cause was pulmonary embolism and heart failure, brought on by complications from his spinal injury. He was 60 years old. The announcement was brief, formal, and final. Flags were lowered. Tributes were issued. A life that had thundered across continents ended quietly in a hospital room. The aftermath was swift and strangely subdued. Patton was buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, at his own request, among the soldiers of his Third Army. The ceremony was dignified but restrained. There was no grand procession, no national mourning comparable to his achievements. It was as if the world, exhausted by war, had little energy left for complicated heroes. Documents related to the crash and Patton's medical care were filed away. Reports were archived. No formal inquiry followed. For many, this was simply the natural closing of a dramatic life. For others, it felt incomplete. Too many things had happened too quietly. Too many questions had been left unasked. In the years that followed, those questions would resurface again and again, fueled by the abruptness of Patton's fall and the timing of his death. But in December 1945, inside that hospital room in Heidelberg, there was no mystery yet. Only the silence of a general who could no longer speak and a world already moving on without him. Yet almost immediately, doubt began to settle into the spaces left by silence. It did not arrive as a single theory or accusation, but as a feeling that something about Patton's end did not sit comfortably with the story told. The accident had been minor. The road had been clear. The general had survived shell fire and air attacks only to be undone by a low-speed collision in peacetime. For some, this was tragic irony. For others, it was the beginning of a question. In the months after Patton's death, official records remained sparse. The accident report was brief and procedural. The medical documentation confirmed the spinal injury, the paralysis, the pneumonia, and the embolism. There was no hint of misconduct, no suggestion of negligence beyond unfortunate timing. The Army had little incentive to reopen the matter. Patton was gone. The occupation of Germany demanded focus, and relations with the Soviet Union were growing more tense by the day. Still, stories began to circulate among veterans and officers. Some remembered Patton's warnings about the Soviets and wondered whether his bluntness had made him enemies in high places. Others recalled how quickly he had been sidelined after his controversial remarks and saw a pattern of quiet removal rather than punishment. None of these ideas were supported by evidence, but they lingered, passed along in conversations that ended with shrugs and unfinished sentences. One figure would later give these whispers a louder voice. Douglas Bazata, a former OSS operative, claimed decades after the war that he had been involved in a plot to assassinate Patton on orders from senior officials who feared his outspoken opposition to Soviet policy. According to Bazata, the car crash had been staged, and Patton had been deliberately incapacitated and then allowed to die. The story was dramatic, unsettling, and impossible to verify. Historians examined it carefully and found no corroborating evidence. Bazata's claims emerged long after the fact and shifted in detail over time. Still, the mere existence of such a story kept the controversy alive. Other theories focused not on assassination, but on neglect. Critics pointed to Patton's medical care, questioning whether more could have been done to prevent pneumonia or embolism. Modern medicine, they argued, might have saved him. At the time, however, spinal injuries of that severity were often fatal. Antibiotics were limited. Intensive care as it exists today did not yet exist. Most physicians who reviewed the records concluded that his treatment had been appropriate for the era. The accident itself was also scrutinized. Researchers revisited the scene near Mannheim, examining maps and eyewitness accounts. The consensus remained that it had been a genuine traffic accident, caused by a truck turning unexpectedly and a car unable to stop in time. The disparity in injuries, while striking, was not impossible. Patton's position in the back seat, the angle of impact, and the partition he struck all contributed to his fate. Chance, not design, explained the outcome. And yet, doubt refused to disappear. Part of it came from Patton himself. He had been a man who thrived on conflict and spoke as if the next war were already underway. His sudden removal from the stage felt convenient to some, especially as the Cold War hardened lines he had predicted. When tensions with the Soviet Union escalated into open rivalry, Patton's earlier warnings seemed almost prophetic, lending weight to the idea that his voice had been inconvenient. There was also the nature of Patton's personality. He inspired loyalty and resentment in equal measure. Those who admired him struggled to accept that he could be undone by bad luck. Those who disliked him were content to let the official story stand. Between these extremes lay a wide space where speculation could grow unchecked. The U.S. Army never reopened the case. No new investigation was ordered, no files unsealed that dramatically altered the narrative. Over time, Patton's death became a footnote to his life, overshadowed by his victories and controversies. Yet among historians, writers, and veterans, it remained a topic of quiet fascination. What makes the doubt endure is not evidence of wrongdoing, but the absence of satisfying closure. Patton's life had been defined by clarity of purpose and decisive action. His death was murky, slow, and bureaucratic. It did not match the man. That mismatch invited questions. In the end, history offers no proof that George Patton was murdered, silenced, or deliberately neglected. The records support a tragic accident, followed by complications that medicine could not overcome. But history also acknowledges the power of timing, personality, and perception. Patton died at a moment when his voice no longer fit the narrative of peace. He died quietly, without the chance to reshape his legacy or challenge the decisions of others. That is why the doubts never died. Not because they are proven, but because they speak to something unresolved in the story of a general who refused to be quiet, even when the world wanted him to be. His grave in Luxembourg remains a place of honor and unease, a reminder that some endings, no matter how thoroughly documented, leave behind questions that history cannot fully silence.